When I'm out at trade shows or user groups, one of my favorite user stories goes something like, yeah, everyone at my company thought monitoring was just noise, but I did some of the things I learned from SolarWinds, and now it's gone from we hate it to I can't live without it.
But that usually means that the folks in support get a call saying, we have a problem with our monitoring system and we can't live without it. And when we dig into the issue, it's often something that's been lurking in the background for a while. Database maintenance hasn't run, or storage isn't performing the way the database needs it to.
Right, and then folks wonder how they didn't know about it sooner. And of course, the answer is
monitoring. Monitoring engineers are so caught up in helping other teams capture data, they forget to do the same for themselves.
It's a typical case of the shoemaker's children.
The who?
Oh, come on. You know the story about the cobbler who had time to make shoes for everyone else in the village, but his own kids went around barefoot?
You are making that up.
I swear I am not. All right, but my point is that monitoring folks are so busy setting up reports, alerts, and other monitoring goodies for other teams, they don't have time to set the same thing up for themselves, which brings me to the title of this Thwack Camp session, Quis custodiet ipsos custodes, or Who Watches the Watcher? Just some quick introductions. I'm Leon Adato, and with me for this session is Program Manager for Orion Core, Kate Asaff. Thank you so much for coming back to Thwack Camp and sharing your wisdom with everyone.
Happy to be here.
Now, aside from the irony of monitoring engineers not monitoring their monitoring, it kind of makes sense, because if you monitor your monitoring with your monitoring solution and it goes down, you won't know. So it's like sending out an email to tell people that the email server just went down.
True, and the most obvious solution, stand up a separate monitoring instance to monitor your first instance, isn't always feasible. But that doesn't mean that you should do nothing.
No. In reality, making sure your SolarWinds environment is up and running is fairly simple. But just to be clear, we are not talking about what could go wrong with your monitoring environment.
No, that was covered in 3 different lab episodes.
Right. And we're also not talking about how to make your SolarWinds environment run better or scale out.
That would be Tom and Destiny's session on optimizing Orion.
Right. In this session, what we're really focusing in on is how and where to look to verify that your SolarWinds environment is healthy.
Right. We've got you covered whether you want to do a quick spot check or you want to set up an automated solution to regularly watch a particular subsystem.
Monitoring. So the way I'd like to frame this, I think, is to start from the outside in. What I mean by that is that I want to look at the ways you can verify the health of your environment, first using basic command line tools or sort of the built-in operating system things. Then we'll take a look at some of the features we've built into the Orion product itself. And finally, we'll talk about external or secondary programs that you can use to augment and know what's going on. All right? And actually, the first thing I want to talk about has nothing to do with a tool or even a command line or a feature. It has more to do with the way that we've structured the Orion cleanup a little bit. Orphan Records has been a challenge for, I think, a lot of folks in the past.
Yeah, that's been an ongoing issue. A lot of times devices will change things like the way they name an interface or perhaps a volume, and they're not so good at telling us what's changed. So then you end up with an orphan record. In NPM 12.3, we will now clean up all orphan interface records in your regular database maintenance. So now you don't have to worry about seeing all those mystery interfaces floating around attached to your devices.
Right, and I've also seen it where organizations have their own customizations in, or they have their own database triggers. I know I just triggered Tom LaRock just by saying that, but they have other processes that maybe work outside of the area of our tools, and that's sort of a little mini commercial for using the SDK if you have customizations, because it works within the structure of our own tools, and therefore you're less likely to have orphaned records which bog everything down. All right, so that having been said, that's just sort of an improvement that I want to make sure people are aware of. The next thing I want to look at is Perfmon counters. They're easy, they're quick, they're part of Windows, they're right there on your polling engine. So what we're looking at here is a whole bunch of SolarWinds things. What are these that I've got here? I mean, not specifically, but are these informational? Are these,
So Perfmon counters are a great way to kind of get an idea of what the services are doing and what's coming into your polling engine at any given moment. One way in which they are super useful is to monitor the amount of syslog and traps that you're getting.
Right. All right. So syslog and trap. Let's almost as much fun as Orphan Records. Syslog and trap. Why are those particularly prickly?
Well, I don't know if you've ever enabled syslog on a firewall on the informational level, but they are chatty devices. They want to tell you everything that happens, and that can cause your database to grow really fast, really quickly. In fact, one of the very first SQL queries I learned as a baby support rep was how to truncate the syslog and the traps table, because we would get a lot of calls from people saying, hey, my database grew by 400 gigs overnight.
Right. And on top of that, though, I think people don't realize that when you start sending all of your trap and syslog to your polling engine, even if most of them are discarded, even all of them are discarded, the server has to process them. It still represents a non-zero and usually a non-trivial amount of processing time. And I've watched environments get hammered, basically DDoSed by the trap and syslog.
By their own network.
Right, so you're right. There are under here the trap and syslog service, and you can put some counters in there. In fact, I got them loaded up. It's a boring server. It's one of my dev servers here. But current TCP connections for the syslog service, total packets, or actual syslog messages, since syslog is exactly one packet, total traps received, and so on. So one of the questions I get asked at trade shows often is, well, it's a Windows box. How do I know what the volume of incoming trap and syslog is? And this is an easy way to do it, especially for a SolarWinds server. But on top of it, once again, you've got a lot of other counters that you can throw in there really fast to know the health of the environment if you take a walk through all the rest of these SolarWinds things. We're not going to go through them today, but we wanted to make sure that you knew that they were there. Now, that's built into Windows. However, we have some features that are built into the Orion tool set or the Orion environment itself. And the first one is polling engine page. So let's talk about what are the kinds of things we can tell as far as the health goes from the polling engine page itself.
I think a big thing you can get an idea of here is just how many elements each polling engine is monitoring. Because if you have multiple people adding things into your environment, they don't necessarily think about load balancing, and then the next thing you know, you've got one poller trying to monitor 20,000 elements.
Right, and we talk about that often is when you buy and scope the environment at first for the right amount of devices, and then it becomes really popular, and so you throw a bunch of stuff, but you don't think about the fact the server needs more.
Right.
Also, love the polling completion number. So what are your thoughts about this? Always must be 100, 99.99 is okay.
High 90s is okay. If it gets below 98, I think that you need to start looking at maybe some load balancing, but as long as we're hitting 98 or better, you should be getting good graphing, good charting, and everything should be good.
Good. I know that there's some 100% purists out there.
That's true.
Okay, I want to point it out. So that's one page that will tell you the overall health. Another one is the database details page. These are all, by the way, under all settings. You can find these pages, but here, this will tell you, again, the number of elements, how many alerts you have configured. As we said in another one of our sessions, the alerting session, every alert represents a query, and that's load on the database also. So that's something to be important of. Then we've got, so polling engine status. A little bit of a story here. Once upon a time, a long time ago, I created a report that gave me all sorts of the elements and each of my polling engines and stuff like that. And then Kevin Sparenberg came and turned it into a web-based report. And that's what you're looking at here. These are all available on Thwack. But as I was showing this to you, you said something very funny. You said,
hey, that looks an awful lot like a page that we have in the product.
Okay, and I have never seen this page, and there's a reason for that. Back on the database details page, all the way at the bottom, total elements per poller. There's a page that looks remarkably like it, but it's the official SolarWinds page, right?
Yes, and to be clear, we did not steal your report.
Okay.
Although we would have if we had known.
All right. Now, this page is nice, but you can't email it.
Yes, and now the big advantage is you have two advantages. Different advantages with a report and a web page. This you can check anytime on the fly. With a report, you can have that emailed to you. So if you're trying to keep a weekly, monthly check on what's being added and what's on each of your polling engines, you can have that report emailed to you and get it right in your inbox.
Perfect. So you got some choices. And of course, we'll have links to all these in the show notes. Last thing that I want to show is actually a new feature in NPM 12.3, the deployment health. Now to get there, you go to All Settings, you go to the High Availability Deployment Summary, which isn't where you might expect to find it. Once you get in there, that second tab, Deployment Health. Even if you don't have an HA environment, you still have the deployment health. And talk me through what I'm seeing here.
So one of the things we mentioned in our intro is that a lot of times we found that there were issues that were lurking in the background that could cause problems if they went unchecked for too long. And we had a lot of customer requests for how do I make sure my system is healthy. So we have a utility based on all of the customer calls we get, things that are sent to engineering, sort of the best list of gotchas we have that can cause a problem in your environment. We now have the health page that will run all these checks every night, or you can run them on demand, and we'll let you know, hey, there's something in here that might cause a problem.
And it's using our new interface, so you can filter on these. If you have a large environment and you want to filter out just the critical problems or the potential issues, you can look for the different sev levels and categories and so forth. So we're using all that wonderful interface goodness. But this is probably one of the primary ways I think that I wanted to make sure people knew about.
This is new and it is very cool. And one of the nice things about it is, okay, we want this to be useful, but we understand that your environment is probably a little different than the next person and the next person. So let's say, for instance, one of the checks we run is SQL Server on a VM. Let's say that you know that your SQL Server is fine and you don't necessarily want to see that every night. If you select that test and go up to silence check, you won't see it anymore. So you can configure this page so that you are truly only seeing things that you care about. And if something pops up like ping all plugins on agents and you say, well, that sounds important, what do I do to fix that? Click on the little caret over there. And we'll give you information on what the test is doing and what you can do to address it.
Oh, great. So this isn't just like, it's wrong, call support.
Exactly.
We're really trying to give some self-help here.
Yes, we want to give you the chance to see what's going on before you have to reach out to us, although we're always happy to help.
Fantastic. Okay, so the next thing I want to go to is some command line tools and things like that. So we're going to dig into that. So the next thing I want to talk about is actually a set of free tools. And I mean that word. I know our legal department gets a little bit nervous when I say things like free, but I mean it. They are absolutely free downloads that you can have and love and enjoy forever. And I find that they're really useful to get the health of my SolarWinds environment. They're good for other things, but using them in the SolarWinds environment is a wonderful way to drink our own champagne. The first one is a tool that came out not so long ago, Traceroute Ng. It is a beefed up version of Traceroute in a way. It uses a whole different set of technology, the technology that we used for NetPath. But one of the things you can do is test connections that ping won't do. Ping is good, of course, for ICMP, but if I want to know whether WMI is working from machine A to machine B, say from my polar to a particular node, and it's not, I can actually use trace ng, and there's the command. So here I have a node, it's not responding. I want to make sure that just the WMI signal, which is port 135, is going to work. And it'll take a second. And here I can tell what it's going through. Did it make it? Is it responding? Am I dealing with a firewall issue? Am I handling a problem? So that's one of the nice troubleshooting tools or features that I like to use. And again, you can download this and put this on all your machines. It's all good. So that's troubleshooting. But when we talk about the health of our environment, database and storage, I think a lot of times it comes down to those two things.
Absolutely. Database, if your database isn't healthy and your storage isn't healthy, you're not getting anything. Right.
And it's also, I think, for monitoring engineers, for the folks who are responsible, we're often accidental DBAs. We're often we're sort of shadow storage people. We get into a lot of that stuff, but I don't know how my stuff is working. And again, you can't easily monitor your monitor with your monitoring, or you don't have the DPA module, whatever. But we have a free, for a single database instance, DPA module, and I actually have that up and running right here. Again, download it, install it. I pointed it at my database. That's the one that I'm running. And I can go and say, oh, well, look, I have a memory issue here. And I have some wait going on. And here, in fact, at 310, I have one thing. There's the query that's causing me a decent amount of wait that's going on. And as Tom Larock will say, waits, locking, and blocking, that's really what keeps the database, or getting rid of those is what keeps the database healthy. But I can use this tool to see what's going on in my specific SolarWinds database and where I should be looking to fix things. Similarly, there we have a storage tool. Again, free storage utility that you point at your storage environment. And you can load up an array. And let's say that one is my array, and I can see how each of the LUNs are doing and each of the volumes are doing, and if there's a problem. In this case, I happen to be running OK. So if I was concerned about the performance of my database, this wouldn't be it. But it might be, that I've got a little bit of memory pressure. Going back here, there might be some memory pressure going on, or it could be, something else here. Again, in this case, because it's my dev environment, it's kind of small, it's doing OK, a little bit of memory utilization, but it allows me to dig into it. So those are some free tools that you can put onto an extra machine or even onto another VM and point at your environment. But when we talk about the sort of built-in monitoring, the other piece of it is the services. Explain to me what we should be looking at in terms of services.
Okay, so there's a couple of key services you're going to want to keep an eye on. First of all, the SolarWinds business layer host, that sort of runs all of the things we do under the hood, like it takes care of licensing and makes sure that everybody can talk to everybody else. As you can see, you'll see a bunch of them in here. It splits into, each plugin has its own little version of it so that it doesn't overwhelm your CPU or your memory. But you want to make sure that you see that running. Another big one that probably a lot of people are familiar with is the SolarWinds Information Service. There are two versions of that, actually. There's a version 3 and then a just plain old regular one. That handles the communication between the polling engines, the communication between the database and the website. That's a big one to keep an eye on, particularly how much CPU and memory it uses. The more concurrent website users you have, the more CPU and memory. You're going to want to make sure that your server is properly spec'd to handle the load that you're putting on these services.
So that gets us to a question about, well, is that number good or bad? And I think we get that a lot from people. Like, just tell me, is 50 good or bad? We can't tell people that, right?
No, you really can't, because it's so dependent on the number of users you have, how you're using the product, how often you're hitting certain pages. It can really vary. So it's sort of a thing where it's not a problem until it is.
Yeah, and just to repeat what I said in a little bit clearer way, we can tell you specifically what number you should be looking for after we've had a sense to understand your environment. But to give here on Thwack Camp a number and say 50, that's the no, because like you said, everyone's environment is a little bit different from the next one. There's always peculiarities that are going to affect the performance. So that's why we're really careful that we're not just going to give you a blanket number here in a situation like this for that. So that covers the built-in command line, the operating system type stuff, some of the free tools you can put on there. But there's also ways within the SolarWinds ecosystem, the full ecosystem, to know how things are going. So I want to dive into that here for a minute. Built into SolarWinds Application Monitor are a few tools, features, templates that will help you know the stability of your environment. One that I think a lot of our users stumble upon fairly easily are the two Orion server ones, the legacy Orion server and then the 2017.3, which came out about a year ago.
Right, very popular templates.
But there's a few other ones that are hiding in there. They're not tagged specifically to say, these are for SolarWinds or whatever, but they still work really well. For example, one is the NetFlow Analyzer. So these are both specifically to monitor your NetFlow traffic database, and you can point it at that and know the health of that.
Yeah, the NetFlow one is particularly important because NetFlow is another protocol where the growth can kind of creep up on you. So it's good to have sort of an idea of what's running and how many flows you might be getting so you can prevent that from happening.
Right. So, and we know that NetFlow is especially challenging just because of the sheer volume. Another one is the SolarWinds Web Performance Monitor player. So here you're monitoring the actual web player to make sure that it doesn't go down.
Exactly, yeah. So that you can make sure if you've got end user monitoring set up for your websites, that's still happening and the player is still running and communicating back to the main poller.
Right. So there's a few other ones, but you want to look through and see if these templates can help you maintain the stability of your own environment. However, it does lead back to the same question we asked at the beginning. These are great. I've got SAM. I have one instance of SAM, my production instance. Is it OK to point it inward? Is it OK to monitor my polling engine with itself using one of these templates?
So it is, obviously, if you have a complete system outage, which we hope never happens, but occasionally it does, that's not going to be so valuable in terms of alerting you when it's happening. But one of the nice things about having these templates assigned is that it gives you a really good history, right? So it's extremely valuable for support, because one of the questions we always ask you is what changed? And one of the answers you always give us is, I don't know.
Nothing.
Yes. So when you have the template running and it's collecting that history and you have all those graphs, you know, it really gives us an idea, or a really good way to say, okay, like right here is where memory shot up through the roof and today nothing is responding.
Got it. So it's not just a matter of watching screens, that you can use your monitoring tools to collect data. I will, however, put in a commercial that if your monitoring system is monitoring mission critical systems, it is by definition mission critical, and therefore you should do all the things you would do for your mission critical systems. Therefore, it should have high availability, it should have disaster recovery, it should have a test environment. You shouldn't throw new devices straight into production when you've never tried them out before. You should have a test environment. And there are ways to do that. There are ways to get a scaled down SolarWinds environment for testing, and then you can use that test environment to point back at your production environment. And that is, even though this is okay, I still feel like that's a better way to do it. Then if your production environment goes down or is really significantly impacted, you've got that other thing to still say, hey, there's an issue going on.
Right.
Okay.
And that gives you the benefit of still having the separate alerts. So
the other point I want to make here is that because they're SAM templates, baselining is all built into it. And I really feel like that's one of those features, we talk about it a lot. But when you want to know not just what changed, but is that normal? Yeah, you know, baselining is one of those things that tells you, yeah, it's running hot, but it's always run hot. It's always been,
yes.
You know,
you can't tell if something is good or bad until you know what's normal.
Right, and maybe normal, that's where support would come in and say, yes, that's normal for your environment, but that's really not what we like to see, and here's how you can make some adjustments. But
exactly.
The baselining will tell you, and will also give you that predictive analysis. Now there's a difference, I just discovered this not too long ago, there's a difference between the baselining in SAM and the baselining that people are used to in NPM, the nodes. That the baselining in nodes is roles, but the baselining in SAM, you click it and it takes the existing data and develops your baseline.
Yeah, I think it's probably important to mention there that you have to have the template running for at least 7 days before it can run the baseline.
Right, and then you go back into the template, click set baseline, and now you're starting to work on it.
Right.
Because when people finally sort of hook on to baselines, they get really excited about them and they turn it on for everything, but it's not going to really get it for you until it. Okay, great. So as long as we're on the subject, what are some other ways we can use SolarWinds tools to monitor our environment? Like, you know, use that reflecting back at us.
Well, you know, we talked about the importance of sort of knowing what your normal is and what your baseline is. Another great way to sort of get an idea is to use the Web Performance Monitor, WPM, to monitor your website. And the really cool thing about WPM is that it will show you step by step the time it takes to get to each page, and you can set that up from a polling engine, from a desktop, from, you know, wherever your users are typically hitting the page. And a lot of times people have discovered database issues before they become really huge by noticing that those pages have started to take longer and longer and longer.
Right, and the thing I also like about it from the monitoring engineer standpoint is I set up the actions once. Here are the steps. I can now deploy that recording in a dozen places. As you see here, we've got the same recording running from multiple places, so now I can triangulate and say, no, the site's okay, but from the Tupelo, Mississippi office, it's not doing so good, or whatever it is, rather than, oh no, it's all bad.
Right.
Okay.
And you can even set up custom thresholds, so you know that maybe it's going to be a little faster from New York than it is from China.
Got it. Okay, that's good. All right, so along with WPM, we talked earlier about Syslog and Trap and how they can be a little bit of a challenge. First of all, if you're dealing with, you know, a high volume of log and Trap information, you are probably a great candidate for our log manager tool. It does almost 100 million messages per day. It has a huge volume. It handles it more effectively. You can search through it. That's really where you're going to get like the efficiency of being able to use those logs. That having been said, another smaller tool that you can use to to leverage is Kiwi Syslog. Now in this case, if you have a large volume of log messages that are mostly junk and you want to just throw them out or whatever it is, you can put a load balancer and an instance or two of Kiwi, and then have all those, and have the rule set synchronized, and then have all of those messages coming in. You can filter them out, you can, throw them into, a web page, whatever you want to do, and then put the messages that are most meaningful back into your Orion environment. So that's just another way to get around sort of that volume issue, so that your primary polar, so that your environment is not being hammered by the majority of things that you're never going to use. That's, again, all garbage messages. One more thing that is built into the system that a lot of folks, I think, initially noticed when it came out, but it's sort of gotten lost in the weeds, is the audit message type. So in the message center, which a lot of folks love to go to and they love to see what's coming in, there's that show audit events. And when you look at that, you can see who did things. So going back to what you said before about like what changed?
Nothing.
Nothing changed. Really?
Yeah.
Because I'm looking at, you made a copy of an alert, you changed this, you added that, and it's all by user login, and it goes back through time. Of course, it's a wonderful way to see who did what and when they did it, and what they did it to. So this is another way to know the health of your environment, by having that audit, literally that audit trail of what's going on.
It really helps you keep track of when there are too many cooks in the kitchen.
Right, exactly. So what's another, way that we can use our tools back on ourselves?
Well, we have a lot of out-of-the-box alerts that will help you judge when maybe something is starting to go awry.
Okay, so you're thinking like the service, just regular service alerts, stuff like that?
Actually, my personal favorite alert is the alert me when a polling engine has not been updated for 10 minutes.
You mean this one?
That's the one.
Okay, so what's going on? I mean, it seems fairly simple, just...
Yeah, so what we do is we monitor the inserts that are going to the database for each polling engine, and if we don't see an update in 10 minutes, we will send you an alert, because chances are if nothing's happening over 10 minutes, something's going wrong.
Either you have a really small environment,
yes,
or you've got a problem.
Exactly.
Now, we've got a bunch of those built-in alerts. I actually made copies and I sorted them here. So on the screen you see the O2 SWs. That's not how they show up in a default installation, but you can get an alert about remaining licenses, when the discovery and import are complete, especially if you're running regular, nightly, weekly discoveries and you want to know that it did complete or it didn't complete, you can do that. Discovery failed, same idea. Polling rate limit exceeded. That sounds kind of interesting.
So basically what that's going to tell you is, hey, you have officially added more things than we can reasonably poll on this polling engine, and it's time to either change some polling intervals, or maybe add a second poller, or maybe go back to your audit trail and see who exactly is putting things in, and are they really important enough for SolarWinds to be monitoring.
Great. So a lot of times when we're talking about alerts, I say that the default out-of-the-box alerts you should never use as is. You should salt to taste. That in the same way that my grandmother would never look at that recipe on the back of that soup box, like that's not a recipe, that's a vague suggestion, right? That these are not best practices alerts. Generally speaking, I tell folks to take them, look at your environment, and tune them. But that's not the case with these.
No, these are more alerts for someone like me who buys the pre-made cookie dough and then tells everybody I made cookies. In other words, you don't really need to change or edit these. They're sort of designed to work as is.
Okay, because they're specifically about the health of the SolarWinds environment.
Right.
So we know what we're dealing with. Okay, so that's just a good thing to keep in mind. But they're all really useful to get insight into the health of your overall, the overall environment. Then there's one other thing that we were talking about earlier that caught me, which was what to do when there's a problem. I had never thought about using the service restart action.
Yeah, it's actually a really convenient action option that you have in your alerts, where the alert, once it detects a problem, will go out and try to restart a service. So if you have something that's maybe struggling with memory consumption or CPU usage, and you kind of just need it to limp along until you can add more resources, you can absolutely have an alert that will, every time it gets to a certain point or it starts to crash, it restarts the service.
Okay, and there's, I won't say no risk, but having SolarWinds restart its own services seems counterintuitive. Like, it's like I want to change the tire and we're still driving down the road and it's going to be okay. And
It's not without risk. I wouldn't recommend that you restart the alert service, for example, because that's probably going to get you into an interesting loop.
Okay.
But if you have multiple polars and you have one that's struggling a little bit, it can be a useful tool to keep everything running.
Fantastic. Okay, so we've covered a good amount of these out-of-the-box alerts, and that gives you that last piece of insight into the health of your environment. Well, after digging into all of these different techniques, I think there's one more area that we really should mention since we've been in IT for a while and we tell people to read the documentation. Read the documentation. So on the Success Center, support.solarwinds.com, we have the server sizing guide. Now, I think a lot of folks who are watching are like, I don't need to read the server sizing guide because I sized it and it's running and it's great and why would I need to know what the requirements are?
Well, because here's a fun fact. Requirements change. We add new features all the time, and sometimes new features require a little bit more memory or a little bit more processing power under the hood.
Right. I believe the comment was when my phone has more processing power than your server does.
You have an issue.
Yeah. So even though you've been doing all the patches, even though you've been doing all the upgrades and sort of just diligently doing those things, if you don't refer back to the sizing guide occasionally, you may be caught unaware. For example, Windows Server 2012, fantastic version. We all enjoyed it. It is now deprecated. Now, that doesn't mean it's not supported, right?
Right, but it does mean that in the future, you're going to have a release where you will not be able to upgrade if you are running to Server 2012.
Right. So, and we have that in the sizing guide as well. So not just here are the requirements, but here are the coming requirements. Here's where you're going to find yourself. So you can start to make those plans now to make sure your environment is stable and running. And again, that's on the Support Center. And the other one is, again, sort of in that back to the basics idea, is the new to SolarWinds. I know that for a lot of experienced folks, it's hard to go back to the basics like that, but sometimes it's worth going back and saying, so what are you SolarWinds people telling folks who say that they're new to Orion or new to NCM or what have you? You really do discover a lot of interesting things.
Not to mention, if you look on this page, you can see a lot of cool stuff you might not have known existed, like the SolarWinds Academy, training classes led by our instructors where maybe you'll find that you didn't know alerting as well as you thought you did, or there's some new tricks that you can add into your monitoring system.
Yeah, and we see that when we go to shows a lot. People will come up and say, yeah, I've been using SolarWinds for 35 years now, or whatever it is, right? And they say, oh, that's wonderful. Have you seen this? It's like, no, is that new? Well, in geological time, it's been out for 3 years, but yeah, new depending on how your perspective is, that folks use the features they use, and they don't always go exploring the features that they either don't have an immediate use case for. So you want to take a look at these and say, oh, wow, I hadn't thought about using it like this or like that. Mm-hmm. There is way more available than I suspected before I started researching this whole session.
We treat the stability of our solutions the same way we treat any other feature or module. We listen to feedback, understand how customers are using the tools, and continuously improve based on that input.
That's a really important point. Your feedback is just as important in this area as much as it is for the newest shiny feature in NPM or SAM. So please keep letting us know how your environment is holding up, whether that's on Thwack or when you see us at conventions or user groups, or if you end up opening a support ticket. The goal is always to make every aspect of your monitoring solution better so you can focus on solving the real production challenges that you're facing.
That's very inspirational.
I try. For ThwackCamp 2018, I'm Leon Adato.
And I'm Kate Asaff. Thanks for watching.